story told about a priest who told his parishioners at the end of the Mass one weekend, next week I want to talk to you about the 17th chapter of Mark's Gospel, and I want each of you to read it in preparation for my homily. So the next week he began his homily with these words. He asked, how many of you read the 17th chapter of Mark's Gospel? And about 3/4 of the church raised their hand. And he said, okay, thank you. Mark's Gospel only has 16 chapters, which leads me into my homily about honesty. Well, the priest is right about this, saying Mark's Gospel only has 16 chapters. It is the shortest of all the 4 Gospels. You can actually read the Gospel of Mark out loud in about an hour without having to rush through it. Because it is so short, Mark's Gospel includes only the essentials of Jesus' life, at least those things that Mark thought were essential. Mark's Gospel doesn't contain any details about the birth of Jesus. Mark didn't think that was important for his first century audience. Mark wanted to deal with the adult Jesus and what his life meant to those first century followers. It is precisely for this reason that scholars say it's important to notice every detail in Mark's Gospel, because every detail is there for a reason. The first line of our Gospel today is a great example. Jesus left the district of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee into the district of the Decapolis. Those details mean very little to us, but to the first century Jew, this information would have very quickly piqued their interest, because they would have recognized immediately that Jesus had left Jewish territory and went into the territory of the Gentiles. And it would have been a signal for those first century people that Jesus was concerned with the whole human race and not just the Jewish people. Consequently, those first century hearers of this story would draw 2 conclusions. Number 1, there is no limit to the kingdom that Jesus has come to establish. It's not just for the scribes and the Pharisees. It's not only just for the Jews. It's open to people of every race and nation. And then the second thing would be this. Everyone who hears about Jesus will be given the grace to follow him. And while those lessons were important to the first century Jewish community that Mark was writing to, I think they're equally important to 21st century Christians today. Because I don't think that we're beyond quite being exclusive. Sometimes we too fight hard to decide who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't belong to the Christian community. We too are sometimes caught up in trying to determine who's going to get to heaven and who isn't. Father Jim Sparrow spoke about this in a morning reflection he did here in this very church a couple of years ago. He was speaking about some of our own prejudice, and he said, I think we're all going to be a little bit surprised when we get to heaven. We're going to look over at someone and think, how did they make it here? While preparing this homily, I came across this story. For the first time ever, students at Wilcox County High School in Rochelle, Georgia, danced together at a prom that wasn't segregated. The story went on to say that at this high school there had always been 2 proms, one for white students and one for black students. Now you might have thought that this story would have been written in the 1960s or 70s or 80s, but it actually occurred in 2013, according to the article by ABC News. Up until that time, the prom at Wilcox High School had always been a segregated event. In fact, there were 2 proms, one for the black students and one for white students. Students had lobbied for years to end the practice, but this year a group of Wilcox County seniors decided to take matters into their own hands. 4 girls, 2 blacks and 2 white, created a Facebook page asking for support and donations to fund an independent prom open to everyone. We were doing that so that the word could get out, one of them said, so that people would be able to donate and help us out with what we were doing. According to the article, however, one group of students didn't like it and operated a second all-white prom. It's easy to get caught up in who belongs and who doesn't. The first century community of the Jews were the same way. The Messiah they thought was coming for them. The Messiah they thought was coming for their people. But Jesus made it clear that the kingdom of God cannot be owned by one group of people or one faith tradition. God's love was inclusive, and God's plan for salvation was well. That belief challenges each of us to look at who we exclude, who we might hold some prejudice against, who we think is in or out of good standing in the Christian community. When Jesus heals the deaf man, who was an outsider of the Jewish community, he does so with the word "be open," Ephphatha. Perhaps a good model for us as well. We need to be open to God's amazing love for all people. We need to be open to sharing that love with all people. The gay, the straight, the divorced, the remarried, the Democrat, the Republican, the rich, the poor, the Muslim, the Jew, the Baptist, and the Presbyterian. And even now, in the year 2021, we need to be challenged to root out the prejudice that lies in our own hearts. Even now, in the year 2021, we need Jesus to touch our hearts and say to them, Ephphatha, be open. And only when we do, can we experience the depth and the breadth and the width